The sponsor for today's video and the inspiration behind the piece I will be making is Justin Boots. Whether you need a pair of reliable riding boots or you just want a fancy pair of cowgirl boots for a night out in town, you need to check out Justin Boots. So today I'm going to be working with this gorgeous red coral stone. And to start, I'm going to first make the bezel. I'm going to be using 1/8 28 gauge fine silver wire for my bezel. Now I'm going to take that wire and I'm just going to carefully wrap it around the stone. And I want to make sure that I wrap it nice and snug, and where the two ends overlap, I'm going to trim the wire. Now you want to make sure that both ends are nice and flush with no gaps before you solder. Now I'm just going to flex the piece and get it ready. I'm going to place a small chip of hard solder right in between the seam, and I want to make sure that that solder is resting right up against that bezel. Now I'm just going to slowly heat my bezel from above, and I'm going to use my solder pick to guide the solder up into the seam. Now that my bezel is all soldered, I'm just going to double check the fit of it around the stone. So I do have some excess solder at my seam that I'm going to need to clean up. Now I'm going to be using a polishing bit to do this with my flex shaft. The polishing bit I'm going to be using is a black silicone polishing wheel. I'm just going to put it into my flex shaft and get it ready. And I'm just going to gently move it over the solder seam just to clean up all that excess solder. This looks so much better now. Now that my bezel is all done, we can get ready to move on to the next step. I'm going to be using an impression die along with sterling silver sheet in 26 gauge. Now for this step, I'm going to be using painter's tape, urethane, my sterling silver sheet, and my impression die. I'm going to take that sterling silver sheet and place it on top of my impression die, and then I'm going to be using painter's tape to secure it down. I'm then going to place a piece of urethane on top. For this next step, I'm going to be using a 20-ton hydraulic press. I'm going to be placing my impression die underneath the cylinder and I'm going to start pumping. Now as you can see, the cylinder is pushing into the urethane, which is then expanding and pressing into my piece of silver, which is then pressing into the impression die. Now I'm going to need to repeat this step a few times while rotating the impression die to make sure every inch of that impression is fully pressed in. Once I'm done, I'm just going to inspect my piece of silver and make sure that I have a nice, crisp, and even impression. I'm now going to get ready to saw out my horseshoe. And to start, I'm first going to lubricate my saw blade to ensure I have a nice smooth cut in the metal. Now since I am using a thinner gauge of metal for this horseshoe impression, I'm going to need to use an 8/0 saw blade to cut it out. It's really important to take your time during the sawing process and to not use too much pressure because you could run the risk of breaking a saw blade. If you need any more tips or advice, feel free to check out my full-length video on sawing techniques and the correct saw blades to use. I have it linked above. I'm now going to use this sanding drum to clean up any of that excess silver around my horseshoe and fine-tune the shape a little bit more. Now that my horseshoe is all cleaned up, I'm going to get ready for my next soldering operation. I'm going to be using a 22 gauge sterling silver sheet for the back plate. And I'm going to start by flexing my piece and slowly heating it and allowing all of the bubbles to dissipate. I'm I'm then going to place my bezel onto my back plate, and I'm going to use medium solder to solder that bezel down to the back plate. I'm then going to place my horseshoe impression, wrapping around my bezel, and I'm going to flex my piece and slowly heat it once again. Now I'm going to be using a method called sweat soldering to solder the horseshoe to the back plate. As you can see, the solder just flowed, and we can get ready to saw the piece out. Since my back plate is a thicker gauge of metal, I'm going to be using a 4/0 saw blade to saw it out. Now once again, I'm going to really take my time and use as little pressure as possible to ensure that I don't break a saw blade, or even worse, saw out part of my horseshoe. Now that I have my horseshoe all sawed out, I'm just going to go ahead and clean up the edges once again using my sanding drum. I'm now going to hit my piece with this black silicone polishing wheel just to smooth out the edges and get rid of any of the marks left behind by my sanding drum. As you can see, the edges look so much better now. It's now time for my very last soldering operation, and I'm going to be using a small piece of easy solder that I'm going to melt into a ball and gently place onto the bezel of my horseshoe. I'm then going to place my bail up against my bezel, and I'm going to reflex my piece and heat it and allow that solder to flow so the two pieces are connected. It was another successful soldering operation. Now last but not least, I'm just going to place my piece in my pickle pot to give it a nice good cleaning. I'm now going to begin my polishing process, and to start this I'm going to be using 3M radial discs in this order from left to right, starting with the yellow wheel and ending with the green wheel. Now these 3M polishing wheels are easily one of my favorite polishing bits that I use. I find that they are a great way to remove minor scratches, excess solder, and just give your piece a nice good pre-polished shine. I'm going to take a quick break from polishing to add a patina to my piece. I'm going to be using this stuff called Midas Black Max, and this is very, very powerful and very toxic, so you want to make sure to read the directions before using this. Now I like to apply it using a plastic paintbrush, and it's important to neutralize your piece after using this substance. Now I'm just going to be using this foam polishing pad to remove the excess patina from my piece. I find that adding a patina really makes the details in the piece pop. I'm now going to get back to using my 3M radial discs to finish up the remaining steps of my pre-polishing. Once I'm done using my 3M radial discs, I'm going to hit my piece with this polishing compound called ZAM, and this stuff really gives a nice high shine to your piece. Now it does leave a little bit of a residue, so it is important to clean your piece after using it, and I just use some warm water, a toothbrush, and some Dawn dish soap to do this. I'm finally at the home stretch. However, the next step is probably one of the most stressful ones of them all. When it comes time to setting the stone, I really like to take my time with it. I like to use two different tools to do it. The first tool I'm using is a bezel roller, and then once I get all the edges smoothed out, I then like to come in with the bezel pusher to really make sure that there are no gaps in the bezel with the stone. Now that my stone is set, I'm then going to just give my piece a final polish using this polishing cloth. And as you can see, it looks pretty good. And then last but not least, I'm just going to string my necklace chain through the bail. And we finally are done. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And I just want to give a shout out to Justin Boots. Thank you guys so much for all of your support and for making the best cowboy boots out there. Cheers!